Officer Mark Ryan clenched his fists, the veins in his neck visible as he glared down at 17-year-old Caleb King. Caleb stood on the street corner with a few friends, laughing and minding his own business, not expecting any trouble. But Officer Ryan had other ideas. Something about the easy laughter of Caleb and his friends irritated him to no end. Maybe it was the confidence in Caleb's stride, or the way he held his head high. Maybe it was simply the color of his skin. Mark's face twisted in anger, his voice low and sharp. "Think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" Caleb looked at him, puzzled. "Sir, we're just hanging out. We're not causing any problems." But Mark wasn't listening. In a quick, forceful movement, his fist shot out, striking Caleb across the face. The blow came out of nowhere, and Caleb staggered, barely able to keep his balance. He blinked, his eyes wide with shock and pain, feeling the sting and humiliation all at once. The street went quiet as his friends looked on, horrified and speechless. But unknown to Officer Ryan, this wasn't just any kid. Caleb King wasn't just another black teen on the block. He was the son of the state governor, a powerful man known for his firm stand on justice and equality. And as the weight of the officer's fist hit Caleb, setting off a storm he couldn't yet see, no one knew that this single act would change lives and futures forever. Earlier that day, Caleb's day had started out like any other. He was a bright, lively teenager with a sharp mind and a big heart, known for his kindness and a smile that could light up any room. At school, he was popular among his friends and respected by his teachers. And at home, his parents adored him, proud of the young man he was growing up to be. He wasn't just an average kid, though. Caleb's father, Governor Malcolm King, was a well-respected leader, a man who had risen through years of hard work and dedication. Known for his commitment to justice, Governor King had a reputation for fighting against racial injustice. This wasn't lost on Caleb, who admired his father deeply and was inspired by his work. But despite being the son of a powerful man, Caleb preferred to live humbly. He didn't brag about his father's position or use his family's influence to his advantage. Caleb believed in standing on his own, earning respect through his own actions. He was wise for his age, quick to show compassion, and eager to befriend anyone, regardless of their background. That afternoon, after a long day of school, Caleb decided to head down to the local park with a few friends. It was their favorite spot, a place where they could relax and unwind after the pressures of school. They laughed, told jokes, and shared stories. For Caleb, this was freedom, the simple joy of hanging out with friends, with no worries in the world. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Ryan was out on patrol. Known for his harsh and often unnecessary force, he was feared in the neighborhood. He had earned a reputation for targeting young black men, especially those he thought were getting out of line. His actions had often gone unchecked, complaints brushed off as he continued his rounds, believing he was untouchable. Today, when he spotted Caleb and his friends laughing on the corner, something in him snapped. The sight of young black teenagers laughing and enjoying themselves felt, to him, like challenge. So he pulled over, got out of his patrol car, and walked toward them, his gaze fixed on Caleb. "Hey you," he called out, his tone hard and confrontational. Caleb turned, surprised to be singled out. He didn't recognize the officer, but he could tell immediately from his posture and the look in his eyes that this wasn't a friendly encounter. "Yes, officer," Caleb replied respectfully. "You boys think you own this place, don't you? Think you can just hang around, causing trouble?" Officer Ryan's voice dripped with disdain, his eyes narrowing on Caleb. Caleb's friends looked at each other, nervous. They knew the officer by reputation, and the tension in the air was growing. "We're not causing any trouble," Caleb said calmly. "We're just talking." But Officer Ryan wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, his eyes boring into Caleb. "Talking, huh? Well, maybe I don't like the way you're talking." Caleb held his ground, though his heart was beating fast. He didn't want trouble, and he didn't want his friends to get dragged into anything either. But he knew that backing down wouldn't help either. He chose his words carefully, hoping to defuse the situation. "Officer, we're not looking for any problems. We'll move along if that's what you want." "Oh, I think you're already a problem," Officer Ryan sneered, and before Caleb or his friends could react, the officer's fist flew. Caleb's friends gasped, stunned by what they were seeing. The officer's fist connected hard with Caleb's jaw, sending a shockwave through his body. His mind reeled as he tried to process what had just happened. Why would an officer, sworn to protect, attack him like this? As he held his face, trying to steady himself, Caleb could see the look of satisfaction on Officer Ryan's face. But what the officer didn't know was that his assault on Caleb was about to set off a chain of events that would rock the entire city, and his own career to its core. Caleb's mind raced as he staggered, holding his cheek where the punch had landed. He looked around at his friends, who were frozen in place, unsure of what to do. He could sense their fear and anger, but he didn't want them to do anything that would get them into more trouble. But Caleb wasn't going to let this slide. Caleb steadied himself, his mind spinning but his resolve hardening. As he looked up at Officer Ryan, a mixture of fear, anger, and shock filled his gaze. He wasn't just some helpless kid, and he wasn't going to let this officer get away with what he'd just done. But before he could say a word, Officer Ryan stepped closer, his voice low and dripping with disdain. "What, tough guy? Got something to say? Go ahead." Caleb swallowed hard, holding back the retort rising in his throat. He knew better than to escalate things right now, especially with his friends watching. But he didn't back down either. Instead, he held Officer Ryan's gaze, his jaw clenched. A crowd was starting to gather, whispers spreading as people realized what had just happened. Some held up their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded, hoping to capture some evidence of what Officer Ryan had done. Ryan noticed the growing crowd but didn't seem to care. He was used to people watching him throw his weight around. Then, with one last glare at Caleb, Ryan barked, "Move along, all of you. Go on, get out of here before I arrest every single one of you." Caleb, still reeling from the hit, glanced at his friends. He didn't want any of them in trouble, so he gave a slight nod, signaling for them to start walking away. They hesitated, their eyes darting from Caleb to the officer, unsure what to do. But they trusted Caleb, so they slowly began to move away, casting worried looks back at him. As Caleb and his friends began to disperse, he kept his face calm, even as his heart pounded with anger. He knew what he had to do. The blow had been humiliating, and the sting still lingered, but Caleb's mind was already racing with the possibilities. His father had taught him never to be reckless in situations like these, to keep his head cool, especially when dealing with people in power. And while Caleb wanted to let loose with every ounce of rage boiling up inside him, he knew he had to be smart. When Caleb got home, he tried to hide the faint bruise that had begun to form on his cheek. He didn't want to worry his mom, who was cooking dinner in the kitchen, humming to herself like she always did. She was a gentle woman, her kindness and warmth balancing his father's strong-willed determination. But as soon as she saw him, her face changed. "Caleb," she asked, setting down her spoon and coming closer. "What happened to your face?" Caleb hesitated. He knew he couldn't hide this, but he also knew that once he told his mom, everything would change. His mother would be furious, and his father wouldn't let this go quietly. It was an officer, Mom, he said, choosing his words carefully. One of the cops from downtown. Her face paled, her hands trembling as she reached up to touch his cheek gently. "An officer? Did he hurt you? Did you do anything to provoke him?" Caleb shook his head. "We were just hanging out, Mom. He came over, and he punched me, just like that." Just as Caleb expected, his mother's eyes hardened. "He did what?" she whispered, her voice laced with shock and anger. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Caleb standing there, unsure of what would happen next. A few minutes later, he heard her talking to his father, her voice tight with anger. Governor King walked in shortly afterward, his expression a mask of fury barely contained. He examined Caleb's cheek, his hands clenched as he tried to keep his voice steady. "Did he say why he did it?" he asked, his voice thick with anger. "No, sir," Caleb replied, holding his father's gaze. "I tried to tell him we weren't causing trouble, but he didn't care." Governor King took a deep breath, visibly struggling to keep his composure. "I'm sorry, son," he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is unacceptable. That officer will pay for this. I promise you that." By the time dawn broke, the wheels of justice had already been set in motion. Governor King had contacted the city's police chief, demanding immediate action. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with videos of the incident, showing the officer's punch and Caleb's calm, composed reaction. People were outraged, their anger fueling protests that began to spring up around the city, calling for the officer to be fired. Officer Ryan, meanwhile, was oblivious. He had no idea that the kid he hit was the son of the governor, and he went about his day as if nothing had happened. But that morning, as he arrived at the station, he noticed the tense looks on his colleagues' faces. They whispered to each other, casting glances his way. Finally, the captain called him into his office, his expression grim. "Mark, we need to talk." Ryan shrugged, following him inside. He'd been through reprimands before and figured this was just another slap on the wrist. But as he sat down, he noticed the serious look in the captain's eyes. "Do you have any idea who that kid was?" the captain asked, his tone cold. "Just some punk," Ryan replied with a sneer. "Probably causing trouble like the rest of them." The captain's jaw tightened. "That punk you punched yesterday? That's Caleb King, Governor King's son." Officer Ryan's face went pale. He could feel the blood drain from his face as he realized the enormity of what he'd done. The governor's son? How'd he not known? His mind raced, thinking of ways to cover his tracks, but it was too late. The entire city was talking about it, and his face was all over the news. The captain continued, his voice icy. "The governor is calling for your immediate suspension and an investigation into your actions. Do you understand what kind of firestorm you've created? This isn't just a slap on the wrist, Mark. You put the entire department in hot water." Ryan sat there, his heart pounding as he realized the gravity of the situation. He'd always thought he was untouchable, that no one would dare to challenge him. But now he was facing the full wrath of the governor, a man with both the power and determination to bring him down. As Caleb sat in his room that morning watching the news, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. He was grateful that his father was standing up for him, proud that the governor was taking a stand against injustice, but he was also worried. He knew that his father's involvement would make this case far more complicated, and he couldn't help but wonder what Officer Ryan might do to retaliate. For now, all he could do was wait and watch as events unfolded, knowing that this was just the beginning. The officer's punch had set off a chain reaction, one that would shake the city to its core and force everyone, his family, the police department, and the entire community, to confront hard truths. But Caleb also knew that, as the storm grew, he would need to be strong. This wasn't over, and he had a feeling things were about to get a lot more intense. As the first chapter came to a close, Caleb sat by his window, gazing out at the city, wondering what would come next. He knew he was at the center of something much bigger than himself, a fight for justice that had begun with one punch but would end who knew where. The morning air was thick with tension as Caleb watched the city awaken to a day that would bring more than just routine news. His father, Governor Malcolm King, was a man of principle, and Caleb knew that his response to Officer Ryan's assault would be swift and unrelenting. But Caleb had never seen his father as furious as he'd been last night. It was as if the punch hadn't just hit Caleb, it had struck at everything his father stood for. The media, eager for a story, covered every angle. Reports flooded in, showing video clips, statements from shot witnesses, and rumors of the governor's next steps. It didn't take long for journalists to start knocking on their door, hoping to catch a word with the King family. Caleb stayed inside, watching the news with his mother, who kept checking on his cheek, making sure he was okay. His father was already at his office, in the heart of the governor's mansion, preparing his statement. Across town, at the police station, Officer Ryan's face was hard as he sat in the cold, gray office of Internal Affairs. He'd been here before, but it had never been this serious. A young officer, sitting across the table, avoided his gaze, clearly nervous. "So, Officer Ryan, we need your statement," the officer mumbled, shuffling papers. Ryan gritted his teeth. "Statement? You all know what happened. That kid was giving the attitude. He didn't respect the badge." The young officer shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "Sir," the governor's son. "I don't care if he's the governor's son," Ryan snapped, cutting him off. "These kids think they can do whatever they want. Someone's got to keep them in line." But he knew that this time, his usual defenses wouldn't hold. The captain had warned him. This was no ordinary case. There were witnesses, videos, and the public's anger was growing. Officer Ryan's career was dangling by a thread, and for the first time, he realized he might be out of second chances. Governor King's statement went live by midday. Standing at a podium, with cameras flashing and reporters crowding around, he spoke with a calm fury that everyone felt. No young man, no matter the color of his skin, should face violence from those sworn to protect and serve, he began, his voice firm. "Yesterday, my son was attacked by an officer in what can only be described as a betrayal of trust. We demand a full investigation and accountability for Officer Ryan's actions." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "We cannot allow our law enforcement to abuse their power. We must work together to ensure that every citizen feels safe, especially our youth. This is my son, but this is every family's fight." The crowd erupted in applause, but not everyone was clapping. Across the city, groups of people, some who supported Officer Ryan and believed he was just doing his job. began to voice their support for him, feeling that he was being unfairly targeted. They saw him as a symbol of tough policing and argued that he was only facing backlash because of who Caleb's father was. The city was quickly dividing, and Caleb's story became the centerpiece of a much larger conversation about race, policing, and power. Later that evening, Caleb and his mother sat in the living room, watching the protests unfolding on television. People were carrying signs with slogans like "Justice for Caleb" and "End Police Brutality." Others held signs defending Officer Ryan, calling him a hero and protector. Caleb felt a chill as he watched, realizing just how big this had gotten. He wanted justice, but he hadn't expected it to explode like this. "Are you all right, honey?" his mom asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yeah," Caleb replied, though his voice sounded uncertain, even to himself. "I just didn't think. I didn't know it would turn into all this." She squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "Your father and I are here for you, and we're going to make sure no one ever treats you like that again." Caleb tried to smile, but his mind was racing. His face might heal, but the anger and humiliation lingered. He wanted to believe his parents could protect him, but he wasn't so sure anymore. The next few days were a blur of interviews, news segments, and statements from city officials. The police department had launched an internal investigation, and Ryan was placed on administrative leave. The mayor held a press conference, urging the city to remain calm and pledging a thorough, unbiased inquiry. But behind closed doors, the police union was working hard to protect Ryan, arguing that he'd been provoked and that the media was twisting the story. Officer Ryan himself remained defiant, refusing to apologize or acknowledge any wrongdoing. As Caleb and his family watched the news one evening, they saw a spokesperson for the police union speak. "Officer Ryan is a dedicated member of our force," she said. "He has served this city for years, and it's important that we don't jump to conclusions based on one incident. The truth will come out, and we believe Officer Ryan will be vindicated." Caleb felt a surge of frustration. Vindicated? How could anyone defend what Ryan had done? His father turned off the TV, his face grim. "They're trying to spin this, but we're not letting them get away with it," he said firmly. Later that night, as the King family was preparing for bed, Caleb's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it, feeling a strange pang of unease. "Watch yourself, kid. You and your family are playing with fire. People like us don't take kindly to snitches." Caleb stared at the message, his heart pounding. Who had sent this? Was it someone who supported Officer Ryan? Or worse, could it be Ryan himself? He didn't tell his parents about the text, not wanting to worry them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. The morning brought a surprise that no one in the King household could have anticipated. Just as they were finishing breakfast, the doorbell rang. Caleb's father opened the door to find a tall, serious-looking man in a suit standing there, flashing his badge. "Governor King," he said, nodding politely. "I'm Agent Morris from the FBI. May I come in?" Governor King looked at him, surprised. "Of course, Agent Morris. How can I help you?" Agent Morris stepped inside, his expression grave. "We've been tracking Officer Ryan's activities for a while. He's part of a group within the force that we believe is responsible for targeting and harassing minorities. Your son's incident has given us a rare opportunity to investigate this from the inside." Caleb's mother gasped, and his father's face went dark. "Are you saying this wasn't just a one-time thing?" Agent Morris nodded. "Unfortunately, no. We've received reports from multiple sources, but we've lacked concrete evidence. If your family is willing, we'd like your help in bringing this to light. It's going to be difficult, and there may be risks, but we believe you can make a huge difference." Governor King looked at Caleb, whose face was filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Caleb nodded, silently agreeing to whatever came next. "All right," Governor King said, his voice steady. "Tell us what we need to do." As Caleb and his family sat in the living room with Agent Morris, the gravity of their new reality began to sink in. It was one thing to confront Officer Ryan's abuse, but to take on an entire corrupt faction within the police force. That was a different challenge altogether. Agent Morris laid out the plan. "We'll be placing surveillance on Officer Ryan and any other officers we believe are connected. But for this to work, we'll need you to go about your lives as normally as possible. No one can suspect that we're involved. The people we're dealing with, they don't take kindly to threats, and they have powerful connections." Caleb looked at his father, who was nodding solemnly. Governor King turned to his son, his face a mixture of pride and worry. "Caleb, are you ready for this?" Caleb hesitated, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing something that affected countless others. He thought of all the kids like him, kids who didn't have a powerful parent to protect them, kids who were just trying to get by. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "I'm ready." Over the next few days, Caleb's life became a balancing act. He went to school, played basketball with his friends, and tried to act like everything was normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were always on him. He'd catch officers watching him when he was downtown, their stares colder and more hostile than ever. One afternoon, he was leaving school with his friends when a police cruiser rolled up, blocking his path. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as the window rolled down to reveal Officer Ryan smirking. "Look who it is," Ryan sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you, kid? Got your daddy fighting your battles." Caleb clenched his fists, his friends standing tensely beside him. But he remembered what Agent Morris had said: "Stay calm, act normal, don't let them suspect anything." "I don't know what you're talking about, officer," Caleb replied, forcing himself to sound casual. Ryan's face twisted into a sneer. "You better watch yourself. Just because you got people talking doesn't mean anything's going to change." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. As Ryan drove off, Caleb felt a mix of anger and fear. But he knew he couldn't let this intimidate him. Not now, when so much was at stake. That night after dinner, Caleb's father called him into his study. It was a room lined with bookshelves and awards, a place where Governor King made important decisions. But tonight the governor's usual confidence seemed dimmed. "Son," he began, closing the door behind him, "there's something I need to tell you." Caleb sat down, his curiosity piqued. His father's voice was uncharacteristically somber. "I wasn't going to mention this until we knew more," his father continued, "but Agent Morris has discovered something disturbing. There's a pattern in Ryan's record that suggests this has been going on for years, and it's not just him." Caleb's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Ryan and a few others. They've been involved in cases where excessive force was used, often against young black men. And every time, they'd managed to sweep it under the rug. Morris suspects they're part of a network that's hiding behind their badges to cover for each other. They call themselves the Blue Brotherhood." Caleb felt a chill. This was far more sinister than he'd thought. He was just one of many victims, and Ryan wasn't just a bad cop. He was part of something organized, something that allowed officers like him to act with impunity. Governor King reached out, putting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "We're going to put an end to this, son, but I need you to be careful. This isn't just about one officer anymore, it's about a system. And we're going to need all the strength we can muster." The next day at school, Caleb was approached by Mr. Lewis, his history teacher. Mr. Lewis had always been one of Caleb's favorite teachers, a soft-spoken man who encouraged his students to think critically and stand up for what was right. But today he looked tense, almost nervous. "Caleb," Mr. Lewis said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone, "I heard about what happened with Officer Ryan. I want you to know, if there's anything you need, I'm here to help." Caleb hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he could trust Mr. Lewis, but there was something in the teacher's eyes that felt genuine. "Thanks, Mr. Lewis," Caleb replied cautiously. "It's been a lot." Mr. Lewis nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I know you're in a difficult position, and I can't even imagine how hard this is, but you're not alone. There are people in this community who believe in justice, real justice. Don't forget that." Caleb gave a small nod. It was reassuring to know that there were allies out there, people who were willing to support him. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Lewis might be more involved in this fight than he was letting on. That night, Caleb was walking home from a friend's house when he noticed a black car slowly following him. His pulse quickened, and he tried to stay calm, but he could feel his heart racing. He sped up, taking a few quick turns down side streets, hoping to lose the car. But every time he looked back, it was still there, inching closer. He was almost home when the car finally pulled up beside him and the window rolled down. Inside sat a man he didn't recognize, middle-aged with cold, calculating eyes. "Caleb King, right?" the man asked, his voice eerily calm. Caleb didn't answer. He knew better than to engage. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You're causing quite a bit of trouble, kid. Some people don't like that." Caleb took a step back, his body tense. He was ready to run if he needed to. "Listen," the man continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You might want to back off. There are people out here who will do whatever it takes to keep things quiet. I hate to see anything happen to you or your family." Without waiting for a response, the man rolled up the window and sped off, leaving Caleb standing there, shaken but resolute. When Caleb got home, he found his parents in the living room, discussing the latest developments in the case. He hesitated, unsure whether to tell them about the man's warning, but he knew they deserved to know. "Mom, Dad, someone just followed me home," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He threatened me. He said I should back off, that people would do whatever it takes to keep this quiet. His mother gasped, rushing over to him. "Are you okay, Caleb? Did he hurt you?" "No, Mom, I'm fine," Caleb reassured her. But the fear in her eyes mirrored the anxiety he felt. Governor King stood up, his face hardening. "This has gone too far. If they think they can intimidate us into silence, they've got another thing coming." The next morning, the governor made another public statement, denouncing the threats against his family and calling for an independent review of the police department. The city was in an uproar, with people rallying around the King family, demanding justice. As the protests grew, so did the tension. People took to the streets, some holding signs calling for change, others chanting for accountability. But the larger the crowd grew, the more opposition appeared. Groups of counter-protesters began to appear, waving their own signs in support of Officer Ryan and chanting, "Back the Blue." Fights broke out, and soon the police were called in to contain the chaos. Tear gas filled the air, and clashes erupted between protesters and law enforcement. It seemed as though the entire city was on the brink of tearing itself apart, and all because one officer had thrown a punch. Watching the news that night, Caleb felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't meant for things to get this far, for his personal fight to turn into a full-blown crisis. But as he watched the city divide, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about people demanding to be heard. The protests hadn't quieted down. In fact, they had only grown louder, more intense, as days turned into weeks. People from all walks of life joined the movement, demanding change, justice, and accountability. But the rising tension weighed heavily on Caleb and his family. They were thrust into a spotlight that felt both overwhelming and dangerous. Late one night, as Caleb lay awake in bed, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize, but as soon as he opened it, his heart froze. "You're making things worse for yourself. Back down before you regret it." Caleb felt a surge of anger and fear. He had already been followed, threatened, and now they were taunting him. He felt like a target, and he didn't know how much more he could take. The next morning, Caleb decided to tell his parents about the message. He knew they were already on edge, and he hated to worry them even more, but this was too serious to keep to himself. Caleb found his parents in the kitchen, both looking weary but resolute. Governor King had a mug of coffee in one hand, flipping through notes on potential policies to reform the police force. His mother was making breakfast, though the usual calmness of their morning routine had been replaced by a quiet tension. "Mom, Dad, there's something I need to tell you," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. His parents looked up, their expressions immediately shifting to concern. "What is it, Caleb?" his mother asked, setting down her spatula. Caleb handed over his phone, the message still on the screen. His father's face turned grim as he read it, and his mother put a hand to her mouth, horrified. "They're trying to intimidate you," Governor King said, his voice tight with anger. "But we won't let them succeed." Caleb nodded, grateful for his parents' support, but he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted, and that meant he was in more danger than ever. Over the following days, Agent Morris returned with updates that brought a mix of hope and dread. The investigation into the Blue Brotherhood, the corrupt faction within the police force, had uncovered a web of manipulation, lies, and cover-ups. Officers who had engaged in misconduct were protected by their colleagues, reports had been falsified, and cases that should have been prosecuted were dismissed. "Caleb, your case is giving us a chance to finally expose this network," Agent Morris said one evening, sitting with the family in their living room. "But we'll need more than just your testimony to break this open. We're going to need hard evidence, something that ties these officers directly to their actions." Caleb's father looked at Morris, his face set with determination. "What do you need from us?" Morris hesitated. "We have reason to believe that there are meetings happening in secret, officers gathering to discuss their next moves and how they plan to protect their own. If we can get a recording of one of these meetings, it could be the key to bringing them down." Governor King's eyes narrowed. "And how do you plan to get that?" Morris looked at Caleb. "If Caleb is willing, he could help us get closer to one of these meetings." A chill ran through the room. Caleb's mother shook her head. No, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. But Caleb's mind was already racing. This was his chance to do something concrete, something that could bring down the people who had hurt him and so many others. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. His parents turned to him, shock and worry etched in their faces, but Caleb held his ground. "I can't keep sitting around, waiting for them to come after us. If I can help, then I want to do it." Governor King looked at him, pride and fear mingling in his eyes. After a long silence, he nodded. "All right, but we do this carefully. I won't let you go into this without protection." The plan was simple but dangerous. Caleb would attend a basketball game later that week, an event where several officers, including Ryan, were known to gather unofficially. He would wear a wire, concealed in a way that would allow him to record any conversations he overheard. Agent Morris assured him that he'd have backup, plainclothes officers stationed nearby in case anything went wrong. As the day approached, Caleb felt his nerves mounting. He had been through a lot since that punch, but this was different. This was a direct confrontation with the people who had turned his life upside down. On the day of the game, Caleb dressed casually, hiding the wire beneath his jacket. His parents wished him luck, their faces filled with worry, and he promised them he would be careful. As he left the house, he felt a surge of determination. This was for everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been silenced. The gymnasium was packed, the noise of cheering students and coaches filling the air. Caleb took a seat near the back, keeping an eye out for Officer Ryan and his companions. After a few minutes, he spotted them, Ryan and 3 other officers, sitting together, talking quietly. Caleb edged closer, trying to blend in with the crowd as he strained to hear their conversation. "Can't believe the governor's still pushing this nonsense," one of the officers muttered. "Trying to make an example out of us." Ryan sneered. "We'll get over it. They always do. People forget. And if they don't, well, we make sure they do." Caleb's heart pounded as he heard those words. He forced himself to stay calm, pretending to be focused on the game as he continued listening. Another officer leaned in, his voice low. "Ryan, what about the kid? You think he's going to keep his mouth shut?" Ryan's face twisted into a smirk. "We'll handle him if we have to. One way or another, he'll learn not to mess with us." Caleb's blood ran cold. They were talking about him, planning how to silence him. He shifted slightly, trying to keep the wire position to pick up every word. But as he moved, Ryan's eyes locked onto him. "What are you doing here, kid?" Ryan's voice sliced through the noise. Caleb froze, his mind racing. "Just watching the game," he replied, trying to sound casual. Ryan's gaze didn't waver, his eyes narrowing. "Funny, you don't seem like you're here for the game." The officers around him laughed, their chuckles laced with malice. Caleb felt trapped, his every instinct screaming at him to get out. But he couldn't leave, not yet. "Let's go outside, have a little talk," Ryan said, gesturing for Caleb to follow him. Caleb hesitated, but he knew he had to play along. He rose slowly, glancing toward the plainclothes officers Agent Morris had stationed nearby. They gave him a discreet nod, letting him know they were ready to step in if things went south. Once they were outside, Ryan's demeanor shifted. He dropped the pretense of friendliness, his face darkening with anger. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Ryan snarled. "Stirring up trouble, making people turn against us." Caleb kept his voice steady, trying not to show his fear. "I'm just standing up for what's right. You had no right to hit me, and you know it." Ryan laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You don't get it, do you? It doesn't matter what you think is right. People like you don't have power. You can scream all you want, but in the end, you'll be forgotten." Caleb's fists clenched, but he kept his composure. He knew the wire was capturing everything, and he couldn't risk blowing his cover now. Ryan leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "If you don't back off, you're going to regret it. I can make things very difficult for you and your family. You have no idea who you're dealing with." But Caleb had had enough. He stood his ground, looking Ryan dead in the eye. "Maybe it's you who doesn't know who you're dealing with. We're not going to stop until we expose the truth." For a moment, there was silence. Ryan's face contorted with anger, and Caleb could tell he was on the verge of doing something dangerous. Just then, the plainclothes officers appeared, stepping between Caleb and Ryan. "That's enough, Officer Ryan," one of them said firmly, flashing his badge. "We'll be having a conversation with you down at the station." Ryan's face twisted in shock and rage. "What is this?" he demanded, but the officers weren't backing down. Caleb watched as they led Ryan away, feeling a rush of relief and triumph. He had done it. He had gotten the evidence they needed. But he knew this was only the beginning. The air was thick with tension the next morning. Though Ryan had been taken in for questioning, Caleb's father warned him to stay alert. The network behind Ryan, the so-called Blue Brotherhood, wouldn't let this pass quietly. Caleb understood the gravity of the situation, but the victory of the previous night had sparked something new in him, a fierce determination to see this through, no matter the cost. As Caleb got ready for school, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. But he pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the progress they'd made. They had proof, recordings, and witnesses, all pieces of a case that was growing stronger every day. But the Blue Brotherhood was just as relentless. They wouldn't let him keep those secrets without a fight. That afternoon, as Caleb was leaving school, he noticed his backpack felt heavier than usual. He hadn't put anything extra in it that morning, and a knot of dread formed in his stomach as he realized someone must have slipped something inside. Finding a quiet corner near the school's parking lot, he carefully opened his bag. Inside, wrapped in a plain brown envelope, was a stack of photos. Each one showed him at different times over the past few weeks, leaving school, sitting in the park, even standing outside his house. Caleb's heart raced. This wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. The Brotherhood was watching him, tracking his every move, and making it clear that he had nowhere to hide. A small note was tucked into the final photo. In a scrawled, menacing handwriting it read, "Last chance. Drop the case or we'll drop you." Caleb swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down his spine. The danger was no longer distant or vague. It was personal, invasive, and terrifyingly close. That evening, Caleb showed the photos to his parents. His mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock, while his father's expression darkened with anger. "This is going too far," his mother said, her voice shaking. "They're watching him, threatening him. We can't let this continue." Governor Kane placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but Caleb could see the worry in his father's eyes. "We'll increase security around the house and get more protection at the school," he said, his tone steady but grim. "They want us to back down. They want us to be afraid." "But they're willing to do anything to protect themselves," Caleb replied quietly. "I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me." His father shook his head. "Caleb, this isn't just about you. It's about standing up against people who think they're above the law. We can't let them intimidate us into silence." Caleb nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew his father was right, but the fear lingered, coiling in his chest like a cold, unyielding weight. Determined to keep the momentum going, Governor King arranged a press conference to address the threats and corruption in the police force. Reporters crowded into the room, microphones and cameras flashing as the governor stepped up to the podium. Caleb and his mother stood nearby, feeling the weight of the public's gaze. They knew that speaking out in such a public way would only escalate things, but they were past the point of hiding. The world needed to see what was happening and understand the stakes involved. Governor King began to speak, his voice steady and powerful as he described the events surrounding Caleb's assault and the subsequent investigation. He didn't shy away from naming the corruption within the police force or the threats his family had received. "This is not just about one family's fight," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "This is about ensuring justice, accountability, and the safety of every citizen in our community. We will not be intimidated. We will not back down." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of admiration and tension. Governor King's message was clear. They weren't just fighting for Caleb. They were fighting for every family affected by police corruption and abuse of power. As the conference ended, Caleb felt a strange mix of pride and apprehension. They had taken a public stand, but he knew the Brotherhood wouldn't take it lying down. They would retaliate, and they would be ruthless. That night, Caleb lay in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, the weight of everything they were up against pressing down on him. Just as he began to drift off, a loud crash shattered the silence. Startled, he bolted upright, his heart racing. His parents' voices echoed down the hallway as they scrambled out of their rooms. He could smell smoke, sharp and acrid, filling the air. "Caleb, get out of the house, now!" his father shouted, grabbing him by the arm and leading him toward the front door. They stumbled into the yard, looking back at the house in horror. Flames were licking up the side of the house, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood. Neighbors began to gather, staring in shock and murmuring in confusion. Caleb's mother held him tightly, her face pale as they watched their home burn. Firefighters arrived quickly, battling the flames, but the damage was done. Their safe space, the place where they had shared countless memories, was being reduced to ashes. As they stood there, dazed and shaken, a familiar black SUV idled at the edge of the street. Through the smoke, Caleb could make out a figure inside, watching them. The SUV lingered for a moment before speeding off into the night, leaving no doubt in Caleb's mind about who was responsible. The Brotherhood had struck back, and they weren't done yet. The smoldering remains of the King family's home cast long shadows across the street as dawn broke. The air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke, and neighbors and friends gathered, whispering and offering condolences. Caleb's mother stood silently, clutching her son close, her face drawn and pale but her eyes fierce. Governor King watched the embers, his expression steely. This wasn't just an attack on their home, it was an attack on everything they stood for. Caleb, shaken but resolute, felt something inside him shift. This fight was no longer just about his own assault. It was a battle for justice that had spiraled far beyond his personal experience. The fire had taken away his safe haven, but it had ignited something unbreakable within him. A determination to bring the Brotherhood down, no matter the cost. Hours later, once the fire crews had left, the family regrouped at a friend's house nearby. They sat around the dining table, each lost in their thoughts. Governor King spoke first, his voice low and steady. "This isn't just about us," he began, looking each of them in the eyes. "This is about every person who's been bullied, intimidated, or hurt by these officers. They think they can scare us into silence, but they're wrong. They're just giving us more reason to fight." Caleb nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We need to get stronger evidence. If they're willing to burn our house down, who knows what else they'll do? We have to be ready for anything." Agent Morris, who had come by to check on them, leaned forward. "Caleb's right. We need undeniable evidence to break their hold once and for all. The Brotherhood is organized, powerful, and has connections in places we may not even realize yet. We'll need to stay vigilant." Caleb's mother, who had been silent, spoke up softly. "They've taken our home, but they can't take our hope. We'll rebuild, and we'll do it with strength, so that when this is over, they'll know they couldn't break us." Over the next few days, Governor King, Caleb, and Agent Morris began strategizing. The Brotherhood's influence was vast, but with the recordings they already had and the information gathered from previous cases of police misconduct, they were piecing together a case that could potentially expose the entire network. Governor King decided to bring in allies from the state government, people he trusted who would be willing to stand up against corruption. He also reached out to civil rights activists and community leaders, people who had seen the effects of police abuse and who would be unyielding in their support. "We'll need more than just our voices," the governor explained one evening. "We need a coalition of people who believe in justice, who can't be intimidated by the Brotherhood's tactics." As the investigation deepened, Agent Morris uncovered a surprising lead. Hidden within police files were records of off-the-books meetings organized by certain officers who were suspected of being Brotherhood members. The locations of these meetings were carefully chosen to avoid suspicion. Abandoned warehouses, private homes, and sometimes even properties seized by the city but not yet sold. One address stood out. It was an old building on the outskirts of town, a place where Ryan and other officers were reportedly seen gathering late at night. Morris suspected it was a central meeting point for the Brotherhood's inner circle, a place where they felt secure to discuss their plans without fear of being overheard. "Governor, if we can get someone close enough to record one of these meetings, we'll have enough evidence to start a major case against them," Morris explained, a determined gleam in his eyes. Caleb, listening to their conversation, felt a familiar sense of purpose stir within him. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady. "They won't suspect me if I'm careful. I know the risks, but we need this evidence." Governor King looked at his son, concern and pride mixed in his gaze. He knew the importance of this mission, but he also knew the danger involved. After a long pause, he nodded. "If you're willing, we'll make sure you're prepared. But we're not sending you in alone." Over the next few days, Caleb trained with Morris and a few trusted allies. They taught him how to blend into his surroundings, how to use the discreet recording equipment without detection, and what to do if he was discovered. The training was intense, but Caleb stayed focused. This was his chance to gather the proof that would take down the Brotherhood once and for all. Finally, the night arrived. Caleb, dressed in nondescript clothes, tucked the recording device into his jacket and took a deep breath. His father clasped his shoulder, giving him a look that said more than words ever could. "Be careful, son. We're right here if anything goes wrong." Caleb nodded. He felt the weight of his parents' trust and the support of everyone who had been hurt by the Brotherhood. With a final glance back, he slipped into the night, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Caleb arrived at the old building, keeping to the shadows. Through a broken window, he saw a group of men gathered in a dimly lit room, their voices low and serious. He recognized Ryan immediately, standing at the center of the group, his expression hard and ruthless. Caleb activated the recording device, his heart pounding as he strained to hear their conversation. "Governor King and his family think they're untouchable," Ryan sneered. "But we're not done with them yet. That fire was just a warning. If they keep pushing, we'll hit them where it hurts." The other officers nodded, their expressions grim and determined. Another man spoke up, his voice filled with anger. "If the governor thinks he can bring us down, he's mistaken. We'll make sure he regrets ever coming after us." Caleb's hands shook as he listened, but he kept his focus, capturing every word. The men discussed plans to intimidate witnesses, falsify records, and eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their network. It was a chilling glimpse into the depth of their corruption. But then, Ryan's voice dropped lower, and Caleb had to lean in to catch his words. "There's one more thing," Ryan said. "Caleb King, the kid's a problem. He's already got people rallying around him, and if we don't shut him down, this whole thing could blow up in our faces." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "We'll make it look like an accident," Ryan continued, his tone cold and calculating. "A hit and run, maybe. Something no one can trace back to us. Once he's out of the picture, the governor will fall in line." Caleb's blood ran cold. They were planning to take him out, to kill him, just to silence his voice. Just as Caleb was backing away, his foot brushed against a loose piece of debris. The sound was faint, but it was enough to catch Ryan's attention. He looked up sharply, his gaze sweeping the room. "Who's there?" Ryan called, his eyes narrowing. He took a step toward the window, and Caleb's heart raced. He needed to get out now. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Behind him, he could hear the shouts of the men inside, the sound of footsteps pounding as they chased after him. Caleb sprinted through the darkness, the recording device clutched tightly in his hand. He darted through the maze of alleys, his mind racing. He had to get to safety, to get the evidence into the hands of someone who could protect him and take down the Brotherhood for good. As he rounded a corner, a black SUV screeched into view, its headlights blinding him. He skidded to a stop, heart hammering, as the vehicle's doors flew open and 3 men stepped out, blocking his path. One of them grinned, holding up a familiar badge. "Game over, kid." Caleb braced himself, backing up against the wall as the men advanced, their intentions clear. He was trapped. Caleb's mind raced as the men closed in, their expressions predatory. His fingers clenched around the small recorder in his pocket. He knew he couldn't let them take it, not when it held the proof that could expose the entire Brotherhood. But with 3 officers blocking his way and nowhere to run, escape seemed impossible. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the alley behind them. Headlights flashed across the men's faces, and the rumble of a car engine grew louder. For a brief moment, the men hesitated, glancing back, allowing Caleb a split-second opportunity. Without thinking, he darted into the shadows, slipping between a narrow gap in the buildings and sprinting as fast as he could. "After him," Ryan shouted, the fury in his voice unmistakable. Caleb heard their footsteps pounding behind him, but he kept moving, his mind focused on just one goal: survival. Caleb's lungs burned as he ran, his legs aching with every step. He rounded a corner, hoping to lose them in the maze of alleyways. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but he knew they were still close. Just as he was about to turn another corner, he spotted a small metal staircase leading up to the roof of a nearby building. Without hesitation, he leaped onto it, scaling the stairs as quietly as possible. He crouched on the rooftop, peering over the edge as his pursuers scored the ground below, flashlights sweeping across the walls and shadows. Caleb held his breath, praying they wouldn't look up. After what felt like an eternity, the men finally gave up, their voices fading as they moved further down the alley. Caleb exhaled shakily, relief flooding through him, but he knew his safety was only temporary. He had to get this evidence to his father and Agent Morris before the Brotherhood made another move. Caleb made his way across the rooftops, keeping to the shadows. When he reached the edge of the neighborhood, he climbed down, emerging onto a quiet street. He knew he couldn't go directly to his father's temporary office. The Brotherhood would likely be watching. Instead, he called Agent Morris from a payphone a few blocks away. "Morris, it's Caleb," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're onto me. I've got the recording, but they almost caught me." Agent Morris's voice was tense. "Where are you? I'll send someone to pick you up." Caleb gave him the location, his heart still pounding. "Please hurry. I don't think I'm safe out here." Within minutes, a black SUV pulled up and Caleb climbed in. Agent Morris was at the wheel, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. "Did they see you?" Morris asked as he pulled away, his tone sharp and focused. "No, I don't think so," Caleb replied, "but they're not giving up. I overheard them. Ryan's planning to get rid of me. They want to make it look like an accident." Morris's face hardened. "We're not going to let that happen. They've crossed the line, and this recording is exactly what we need to make sure they pay for it." Back at a secure location, Caleb handed over the recording device to Morris. The agent listened to the incriminating conversation, his expression growing more serious with every word. When it ended, he looked at Caleb, a fierce determination in his eyes. "This is it," Morris said. "This is the proof we needed. With this, we can expose the Brotherhood's entire operation." But as they began to discuss their next steps, a knock echoed from the door. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. Morris motioned for him to stay put, pulling out his weapon as he approached the door. The door opened, and to Caleb's shock, another high-ranking official walked in, Chief Wilkins, the head of the local police department. His expression was grim, his eyes locking onto Morris. "What's he doing here?" Caleb whispered, a sense of unease creeping over him. Morris held up a hand, signaling for him to stay calm. "Chief Wilkins has been working with us on this case, Caleb. He's one of the few allies we can trust within the force." The chief nodded, his face a mask of worry. "Ryan's men are furious. They know the governor's family is a threat, and they'll stop at nothing to silence you. They're making plans, and they're escalating fast. We need to act before they do something drastic." Caleb looked between Morris and the chief, feeling a surge of both relief and apprehension. The Brotherhood's reach was vast, but it seemed they weren't invincible. With the chief's help, they had an insider who knew their weaknesses, someone who could help take them down from within. With the recording in hand, Governor King and his allies wasted no time. They organized a press conference, inviting every major news outlet to attend. The media had been following the story closely, but they had no idea just how explosive the evidence would be. As the reporters gathered, Governor King took the podium, his gaze steady and fierce. Beside him stood Caleb, Agent Morris, and Chief Wilkins, each one representing a united front against the corruption that had plagued their city. "Today we have gathered to shine a light on the truth," Governor King began, his voice resonating with conviction. "My family has been targeted by those who would rather see justice silenced. But we will not be intimidated. We will not back down." He held up the recording device, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "What you are about to hear is a first-hand account of the threats made by members of our very own police force, those sworn to protect us, yet who have betrayed that trust in the worst way imaginable." The recording played, echoing through the room. Gasps filled the crowd as Ryan's voice rang out cold and ruthless, detailing plans of intimidation, violence, and cover-ups. The weight of the Brotherhood's crimes was laid bare for all to hear, and by the time the recording ended, the room was filled with shocked silence. The reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing and questions flying. Governor King remained composed, answering each question with unwavering resolve. The press conference was a turning point, a moment that would mark the beginning of the Brotherhood's downfall. But the Brotherhood wasn't finished yet. As Caleb and his family returned to their temporary safe house that night, a shadow moved in the darkness. Unknown to them, the Brotherhood had been tracking their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Just as Caleb stepped out of the car, a loud bang shattered the quiet night. He froze, looking around, but he saw nothing, just the distant glint of headlights far down the road. "Caleb, get inside," Morris yelled, his voice urgent. But before Caleb could move, a car screeched around the corner, heading straight toward them at full speed. The engine roared, its headlights glaring, and in that split second, Caleb realized what was happening. They were coming for him. Governor King grabbed his son, pulling him out of the way just as the car swerved, missing them by inches. The vehicle sped off, disappearing into the night before they could catch a glimpse of the driver. Caleb's heart pounded, his body shaking with the close call. He could hardly believe they had come so close, so willing to kill just to cover their tracks. Governor King's face was pale, his expression grim. "We're not safe here. They'll keep coming for us until we bring every last one of them to justice." Caleb nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. They would keep fighting, no matter how many times the Brotherhood tried to silence them. The car's taillights disappeared into the dark night, leaving Caleb, Governor King, and Agent Morris standing in the stillness of their near miss. The attempt on Caleb's life had shaken them all, but it also strengthened their resolve. They could see now just how far the Brotherhood was willing to go to protect their power, and how dangerous the fight ahead would be. Governor King took a deep breath, his mind racing with plans. "We can't hide forever," he said, his voice calm but determined. "They want us scared, but we're going to face them head on." Agent Morris nodded. "We'd shaken them. Now's our chance to move quickly, while they're scrambling. If we're strategic, we can end this once and for all." Caleb looked at his father and Morris, his face set with determination. "Whatever it takes," he said quietly. "I'm ready." Governor King wasted no time calling in allies from across the state. Civil rights leaders, community activists, and political supporters answered his call, each one vowing to stand with him in the fight against the Brotherhood. They knew the risks, but they also knew that allowing such corruption to go unchecked would only make things worse for everyone. Within days, a coalition formed, with supporters rallying to the governor's cause. Social media buzzed with the news, and more people came forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse at the hands of officers linked to the Brotherhood. The pressure was building, and the Brotherhood felt the walls closing in. But Governor King knew they couldn't rely on public support alone. They needed a decisive strike, a way to expose the Brotherhood's leaders and dismantle their network for good. Through careful planning and with the help of Chief Wilkins, Agent Morris arranged a meeting with one of the Brotherhood's former members, a man named Jake Myers. Jake had been part of the group in its early days, but had grown disillusioned with their tactics. He knew things, locations, names, and information that could tip the scales in their favor. In a dark, quiet warehouse on the outskirts of town, Caleb and his father met with Jake. He was nervous, looking around as if expecting an ambush. "They're everywhere," Jake whispered, his eyes darting from face to face. "They have people in the force, in city offices, even in businesses across town. If you're really going after them, you need to know what you're up against." Governor King leaned forward. "That's why we're here, Jake. We need your help to take them down. Tell us everything you know." Jake hesitated but finally nodded. "There's a safe house," he said. "An old farmhouse out of town where they meet. That's where they keep their files, their records, membership lists, finances, everything that proves who they are and what they've done." Agent Morris's eyes lit up. "If we can get our hands on those files, we'll have enough evidence to charge the entire group." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple. The place is guarded, and they have alarms everywhere. If you're going to break in, you'll need a solid plan, and you'll have to be quick." Governor King nodded. "Thank you, Jake. We'll be careful." As they left the warehouse, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Brotherhood was dangerous, and with every step they took closer to justice, they were also moving deeper into enemy territory. The following night, Caleb Morris and a small team of trusted officers prepared to raid the farmhouse. The plan was simple: get in, gather the evidence, and get out before anyone could sound the alarm. The farmhouse loomed in the darkness as they approached, its windows dark. Caleb's heart pounded as they crept toward the building, their flashlights illuminating the path in front of them. The silence was thick, but the tension in the air was palpable. They reached the side door, and Morris quickly picked the lock, gesturing for the team to follow him inside. The farmhouse was empty, but they knew the files were hidden somewhere in the basement. They moved cautiously, scanning every corner for signs of alarms or traps. In the basement, they found a heavy, locked cabinet. Morris worked quickly, his fingers moving with practiced precision, and with a click, the cabinet door swung open. Inside, stacks of folders and USB drives lay in neat rows, each one labeled with names, dates, and transactions. This was it, the evidence they needed to expose the Brotherhood's crimes. Caleb grabbed as much as he could, stuffing files and drives into his bag. They were so close now, all they had to do was get out. As they made their way back up the stairs, a loud bang shattered the silence. The door burst open, and they found themselves face to face with a group of Brotherhood officers, their guns drawn and expressions cold. "What'll," sneered Ryan, stepping forward. "Did you really think you could just waltz in here and take what's ours?" Governor King held up his hands, his face calm but his eyes blazing. "It's over, Ryan. We have the evidence. There's nothing you can do now." Ryan laughed, the sound chilling in the quiet room. "You think that little pile of files is going to stop us? We have power you can't even imagine. And you're just a family standing in our way." Caleb felt a surge of fear, but he pushed it down, standing tall beside his father. "You can't keep hurting people forever, Ryan. People are watching now. They know what you've done." Ryan's expression darkened. Brave words for a kid who doesn't understand how the world works. "But don't worry. You won't have to worry about that for much longer." He raised his gun, aiming it directly at Caleb. In that tense moment, everything seemed to slow down. Caleb could see the anger in Ryan's eyes, the determination of his father standing beside him, and the uncertainty of the officers around them. He knew they were outnumbered, but he also knew they couldn't back down now. Suddenly, Agent Morris lunged forward, knocking the gun out of Ryan's hand. Chaos erupted as the room filled with shouts and scuffling, officers struggling against each other in the confined space. Caleb and Governor King fought alongside Morris, using every ounce of strength to defend themselves. The Brotherhood members were strong, but they hadn't expected resistance, and their surprise gave the governor's team the upper hand. As the fight continued, sirens sounded in the distance, flashing lights illuminating the farmhouse windows. Reinforcements were on their way, and with them, the final pieces needed to end the Brotherhood's reign of terror. One by one, the Brotherhood members were subdued, handcuffed, and led outside by the arriving officers. Ryan, his face twisted with rage, glared at Governor King as he was dragged away. "This isn't over," he spat. "There are more of us. People in places you'll never reach." Governor King met his gaze calmly. "You've lost, Ryan. Your time is over." As the sun rose over the farmhouse, Caleb and his family stood together, watching as the last of the Brotherhood members were taken into custody. The nightmare that had haunted them was finally over, and the evidence they'd gathered would ensure that justice would be served. Caleb felt a sense of peace wash over him, knowing that they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for every person who had been hurt by the Brotherhood's corruption. It had been a hard, painful journey, but they had emerged stronger, united, and unbreakable. Governor King placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, his face filled with pride. "You were brave, son, braver than I could have ever imagined." Caleb smiled, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. "We did it, Dad. We really did it." Together, they turned and walked into the dawn, ready to rebuild, to heal, and to create a world where justice and equality would finally prevail. The days that followed the raid on the farmhouse were filled with a whirlwind of activity. News outlets flooded with coverage of the Brotherhood's downfall. As more evidence emerged, the corruption that had permeated the police force and city government was laid bare for all to see. The community rallied, and voices that had once been silenced began to rise, demanding accountability and change. Caleb found himself at the center of this change, his experiences and bravery inspiring many. He participated in community meetings, sharing his story and advocating for reforms in policing and community relations. Governor King became a beacon of hope, his resolve to create a safer, more just environment stronger than ever. One afternoon, Caleb stood in front of a crowd at the town square, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. People of all ages had gathered, their faces filled with anticipation. This was a moment to honor not just the bravery that had brought the Brotherhood down, but the promise of a better future. "I stand here today not just as the governor's son," Caleb began, his voice steady and clear, "but as a member of this community, a community that has faced fear and violence, but is now standing up for what is right." The crowd erupted into applause, and Caleb felt a surge of pride and purpose. "We have shown that we will not be silenced. We will not live in fear. It's time to rebuild our community, to ensure that everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of where they are." Caleb's words ignited a fire within the crowd. Ideas for community programs, support systems, and outreach initiatives flowed freely. The sense of unity was palpable, and for the first time in a long time, hope seemed within reach. As the weeks passed, the remnants of the Brotherhood were slowly dismantled. Trials were held, and many of the members were sentenced to prison. Caleb watched as justice was served, but he also felt a lingering heaviness. It was hard to shake the memories of the fear and violence that had been a part of his life. One evening, sitting on the porch with his father, Caleb finally spoke about it. "Dad, do you think it will ever really change? Will people ever stop being afraid of men like Ryan?" Governor King looked thoughtfully at the horizon, where the sun was setting in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "Change takes time, Caleb. It's not easy, and it often doesn't happen overnight. But each step we take brings us closer. Your bravery has inspired many, and that's how we start to heal." Caleb nodded, but the doubt lingered. He had faced his fears and fought against injustice, but the scars remained. Then Governor King surprised him. "Let's honor those we've lost in this fight, those who were hurt or scared. We can create something positive out of all this." "Like what?" Caleb asked, intrigued. "A community center, a safe place where kids can learn, grow, and express themselves without fear. A place that stands for what we believe in." Caleb felt a spark of excitement. I love that idea. We could have programs, mentorship, everything. Governor King smiled, his eyes lighting up. Exactly. It's time to turn our pain into purpose. Plans for the community center quickly took shape. With the help of local businesses, community leaders, and citizens, they secured funding and a location. Caleb found himself deeply involved in the process, from organizing fundraisers to brainstorming programs that would cater to the needs of the community. One evening, as Caleb sat in a meeting room surrounded by community members discussing the center's future, he felt a surge of hope. This was a new beginning, a chance to make a lasting impact. They talked about everything from art classes to self-defense workshops, all aimed at empowering young people and fostering a sense of belonging. As the days turned into weeks, the community center began to take shape. Caleb and his father worked side by side, pouring their hearts into the project, and with each brick laid, Caleb felt more at peace. The weight of his past was still there, but it was lighter now, replaced by the excitement of building a brighter future. Finally, the day of the grand opening arrived. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the new center. A large crowd gathered, buzzing with excitement. Banners hung and colorful balloons danced in the gentle breeze. Caleb stood beside his father, both dressed in shirts emblazoned with the center's logo. Governor King took the stage, and the crowd fell silent, anticipation hanging in the air. Today we celebrate not just a building, but a vision for our community, he began, his voice strong. This center is a testament to resilience, unity, and hope. It's a place where everyone is welcome, where dreams can flourish, and where we can come together to build a brighter future. As he spoke, Caleb looked out over the crowd, feeling a swell of pride. The past months had been a battle, but this was the victory they had all fought for. He stepped forward when it was his turn to speak, his heart pounding in his chest. I want to thank each of you for being here today, Caleb said, his voice clear. This center is for you, every kid who has ever felt scared or alone. Together we can make sure that our community is a place where everyone feels safe, respected, and loved. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Caleb felt a warmth spread through him. He knew that they were just beginning, but the road ahead was filled with promise. As the celebration continued, Caleb stepped aside for a moment, taking a deep breath to soak in the atmosphere. Laughter, joy, and hope filled the air. He turned to find his father beside him. I'm proud of you, Caleb, Governor King said, his eyes shining with admiration. You've turned your pain into something beautiful. This community center will change lives. Thank you, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you, Caleb replied, feeling a mix of gratitude and relief. I think we've really started something special here. As the festivities continued, Caleb felt a sense of closure wash over him. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer held power over him. He was ready to embrace the future, filled with hope and determination. Hand in hand, father and son stepped back into the crowd, ready to celebrate not just the new center, but the new beginnings it represented. This was their moment, and they were ready to make every second count. With the Brotherhood dismantled and the community coming together, Caleb realized that while the battle against injustice was never truly over, they had taken a significant step towards a better tomorrow. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their strength and commitment to change. The road to healing was long, but Caleb knew they would walk it together, ready to support each other and build a world where everyone could thrive.